Grant Roberts.
That apparently was the chair of the Finance and Expenditure Committee, offering us his deep insight into the issues facing potential New Zealand homeowners today. Ironic in his misinterpretation of the words of my colleague Dr. David Clark, he also managed to misascribe his portfolio. Clayton Cosgrove, a close friend of the chair of the Finance and Expenditure Committee, is in fact the Labour Party's revenue spokesperson. I'm sure you'll want the record corrected in that way. No. So that's the thing. It's Clayton Cosgrove, Mr. Bishop. Also, Mr. Bishop, another close friend and colleague of Clayton Cosgrove. Mr. Speaker, this bill is once again following on from the last piece of legislation, a fitting epitaph, I hope, to this government, which is that they want to be seen to do something, but it has to be the least that they can get away with, the absolute bare minimum that they can get away with. The pressure was building on them, Mr. Speaker, about the fact, leading up to Budget 2015, about the fact that they had failed to do anything about a housing market out of control, about a crisis in terms of New Zealanders being able to buy their own homes, about the cost of housing in Auckland going up by 18% a year, then 20% in another year. And they were on the back foot. And we know now that there was nothing in the budget to actually do anything about that. So they rushed through a series of measures, including this one, to make it look as though there was something there. We know that because there was nothing in the budget documentation. When the budget documentation got released in July, absolutely nothing in it about this. You know, the normal process of ideas that are floated around budget time is that about now, actually, for next year's budget, those ideas will be being debated within government agencies, being road tested, being looked at by the Treasury. This wasn't there, because they hadn't decided to do it. It was a last-minute rush job, typical of the way that this out-of-touch government goes ahead. And so what we're left with is a tentative and incremental approach to a deep-seated problem in terms of the way in which New Zealand's housing market works. It's not going to do what they say it will. And bear in mind, this is not the Labour Party saying this is actually the Treasury saying it. The Treasury says that the test is only likely to raise $5 million per year due to high levels of avoidance. When they were asked, well, what would it be without that avoidance, they said they would expect a revenue of somewhere between $30 and $40 million a year. So it's half-hearted, it's less than half-hearted, quarter-hearted, eighth-hearted. That's as good as it gets with this government when it comes to putting forward this kind of legislation. But, Mr. Speaker, when you ask yourself, well, why might that be? Why would they go in such a half-hearted way? It's interesting to look at the comments made by the New Zealand Property Investors Federation when this legislation was put forward. They sort of half-heartedly themselves said that they didn't really think this was a very good idea, but then they came down to the end of it and they said it's unclear if this move will have any effect on house prices. This is the Property Investors Federation. Many New Zealanders believe that speculation in the property market is rife, but there is no data to back up this belief. If property trading is rife and the cause of house price growth, as many suspect, then this announcement should help reduce property prices. If speculation isn't a significant contributor to house price increases, then the effect will be negligible. So the Property Investors Federation are delighted, Mr. Speaker, because the straw man's been set up. So the straw man's been set up. It won't deliver because of the fact that there is such an easy way to avoid it. And then the Property Investors Federation will say, well, we said if this doesn't reduce property prices, therefore there isn't a problem caused by speculation. It's all part of the same way of going about this legislation. The government and their good friends in the Property Investors Federation are setting this regime up to fail. That's as simple as it gets. Because if they weren't, Mr. Speaker, if they were really serious about this, then why would they allow themselves to propose a measure that their own officials say is only going to raise $5 million per year? $5 million per year, a drop in the bucket of the amount of money being made by property speculators, whatever we decide the definition of that is in this House. There would be no member in this House who would try to claim that the benefit from speculation is only in the 5% area. Mr. Speaker, the intention test exists. We all know the intention test exists, but the fact is that it is honoured barely in the breach. IRD have come before select committees in the past and said, look, we've got this, we'd like some more resources to pursue it. More resources have been given to IRD to pursue it, and yet it is an ineffectual measure. The national government knows that. That's why they've been forced into a position to do this. But, Mr. Speaker, it is a particularly weak measure. It's particularly weak too when we learn from Auckland that around 41% of sales, and from the QV data tells us, were to property investors. 41% of sales were to property investors. I have no doubt, Mr. Speaker, and the Labor Party has no doubt, this is forcing up prices. This is pushing new first home buyers out of the market. We do need to do more, and we need far, far more than this kind of half-hearted measure. When it was brought into place, the Finance Minister, Bill English, was quizzed repeatedly about the effect of it, and he said he didn't know. He wasn't sure. Didn't know how it was going to work. Didn't know if it was actually going to achieve what it was set out to achieve, and kind of shrugged his shoulders in the way that Bill English does when he's been made to do something by John Key and the Crosby Textor polling people. Bill just kind of says, oh, well, we'll let it happen, we'll put it in place because it's going to scratch the political itch that's out there. Bill's actually a relatively upfront guy. He couldn't defend it. He couldn't get up there on Q&A and say, yes, no, this is the...
Order. I've just reflected on what the member said. The member can't say that a minister was made to do something by an outside polling company, and the member will withdraw that comment.
Look, I withdraw, Mr. Speaker. So Bill English, heavily influenced by information that he has received, decides that no, he's going to shrug his shoulders and go ahead with something that he does not believe in. And I don't think he does. I think actually some of his colleagues might think they'll get away with this, but they won't. So the loophole that's here that we need to focus on too is the 2-year bright line test, Mr. Speaker, and this has been raised by a number of people. By having a 2-year bright line test, all we do is move that arbitrary line a little bit. We say, all right, you have to hang on to it for 2 years, and we've been told this by people involved in the property investment industry, that quite clearly people will wait out the 2 years, wait to their 2 years in one day, and then move on to sell. And we know that the intention test isn't working, so therefore the 2 years will come up, people will be able to come up with whatever excuses that they already use when the IRD come knocking, and then they'll move on to sell their property. So simply moving the arbitrary line to 2 years simply is not going to deter the land bankers and the small number of people who actually just work as short-term buy and flick speculators. We need a much more comprehensive regime than this. We need a regime that addresses the overall problem of speculation. We need to ensure that those who do not have an intention to come and live in New Zealand are not encouraged to simply speculate in properties here. We want to ensure that people who make a commitment to live in New Zealand, wherever they're from, are given the ability to buy their own home. That's part of the New Zealand dream that all of us, I believe, in this House have some desire to protect. But doing a half-hearted measure like this does very little to do that. We need a far more comprehensive policy than this. Mr. Speaker, I want to finish on something that I will come back to in another stage in this debate, which is the question of when and how long this bill will be debated for. This bill, because the government is so hopeless and incompetent when it comes to managing the business of this House, has to be reported back in very, very short order to even remotely look like that it might pass in time to be put in place this year. Bear in mind, it has to be retrospective now. So I call on the government. It's going to be retrospective legislation. They can't avoid that now. Why bother with such a short report back time? Why not actually take the time to get this piece of legislation right rather than rush it through just as the policy thinking has been rushed through? Mr. Speaker, this is a half-hearted bill designed to make the government look like it's doing something when it's not. We will support this bill to select committee, propose changes and amendments, try and influence this government to come up with something better, but their failure to produce something after 7 years speaks volumes about whether they really want to do anything.
Christopher Bishop.